The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that day. At 28 years old, he had been serving in the Queen's Guard for nearly 6 years, and the weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders just as heavily as his black bearskin hat. The tourists were already gathering behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the stoic faces of the guards who stood motionless as statues. James had always taken pride in his duty. Growing up in a small village in Yorkshire, he had dreamed of serving the crown since he was barely tall enough to see over his grandmother's garden fence. His grandfather had been a guardsman during World War II, and the stories of honor, duty, and unwavering dedication had shaped young James's entire worldview. When he finally earned his place among the elite regiment, he felt as though he was continuing a family legacy that stretched back generations. The protocols were sacred, drilled into every guard until they became second nature. Stand perfectly still. Do not speak. Do not react to tourists, no matter what they do or say. Do not break formation under any circumstances. These rules weren't mere suggestions. They were the foundation upon which the entire tradition rested. James had witnessed fellow guards receive severe reprimands for the smallest infractions, a twitch of the eye, a barely perceptible shift in weight, a moment's hesitation during the changing of the guard ceremony. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of London traffic. The palace grounds were busier than usual, with several tour groups scheduled throughout the day. James took his position at the main gate, his rifle held at the precise angle mandated by centuries of military tradition. His face showed no emotion, his eyes focused on a point somewhere in the distance, just as he had been taught. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Tourists snapped photos, trying desperately to get a reaction from the guards. Children made funny faces, adults told jokes, and teenagers posed for selfies just inches from James's face. He remained unmoved, a living statue in service to the crown. This was his job, his calling, and he performed it with the same dedication his grandfather had shown on the battlefields of Europe. Around midday, as the sun climbed higher and the crowds grew thicker, James noticed a disturbance near the eastern gate. A family appeared to be arguing, their voices carrying across the courtyard in sharp, angry tones. The father, a tall man in an expensive suit, was gesticulating wildly while speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. The mother, equally well-dressed, was clutching a small purse and looking around nervously as if searching for an escape route. Between them stood a little girl, no more than 7 years old, with dark hair pulled back in 2 neat braids. She wore a simple white dress with small blue flowers, and her tiny hands were clasped in front of her as she watched her parents argue. Even from his position 30 meters away, James could see the fear in her small frame, the way she seemed to shrink into herself with each raised voice. The argument continued for several minutes, growing more heated by the moment. Other tourists began to notice, some stopping to stare while others hurried past, uncomfortable with the public display of family discord. James maintained his position, but something about the scene troubled him. In all his years of duty, he had witnessed countless family disputes among visitors, but there was something different about this one, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The little girl suddenly looked in his direction, her dark eyes meeting his for just a moment. In that brief instant, James saw something that chilled him to the bone, pure terror. Not the kind of fear a child might feel during a typical family argument, but something deeper, more primal. Her small face was pale, and her hands were trembling slightly as she continued to watch her parents fight. As the argument escalated, the father grabbed the woman's arm roughly, causing her to stumble backward. The little girl flinched visibly, taking a small step away from both adults. It was then that James noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The girl was trying to communicate with him using subtle hand signals. At first, he thought it might be coincidence. Children often waved at the guards, despite receiving no response. But, as he watched more carefully, he realized her movements were deliberate and systematic. She would catch his eye, then make small gestures with her fingers, always being careful to keep her hands low and out of her parents' line of sight. James had received training in basic sign language as part of his military education, though he was far from fluent. But what he was seeing wasn't standard sign language. It was something else entirely. The girl would point to herself, then make a small circular motion with her finger, followed by what looked like the letter H formed with her tiny hands. She repeated this sequence 3 times, each time checking to make sure her parents weren't watching. The argument between the adults grew more violent, with the man now gripping both of the woman's arms and shaking her slightly. The woman was crying, her voice barely audible from where James stood. The little girl looked increasingly desperate, her signals becoming more urgent. She pointed to herself again, then to her parents, then made a slashing motion across her throat so quickly that James almost missed it. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. The child was trying to tell him she was in danger. The H she kept forming with her hands. Could it stand for help? The circular motion might represent being trapped or caught in a cycle. And the throat gesture was unmistakably clear in its meaning. James felt his heart racing beneath his stoic exterior. Everything about his training, his duty, his sworn oath told him to remain motionless and uninvolved. The protocols were clear. Guards do not interfere in civilian matters. They do not break character. They do not abandon their posts. The consequences for such actions could end his career, disgrace his family name, and betray the trust placed in him by the crown. But as he watched the little girl's increasingly frantic signals, as he saw the fear growing in her eyes and the violence escalating between the adults, James felt something inside him beginning to crack. This wasn't just a family argument or a tourist spectacle. This was a child crying out for help in the only way she could, using whatever means available to reach someone, anyone, who might be able to save her. The man suddenly released the woman and turned his attention to the little girl, his face red with anger. He said something to her in their foreign language, his voice harsh and threatening. The girl immediately stopped her signaling and dropped her hands to her sides, but not before making one final, desperate gesture toward James. She pressed her small hand to her heart and then pointed toward him, her mouth silently forming what looked like the word please. James felt sweat beginning to bead beneath his heavy uniform despite the cool autumn air. His mind raced through possibilities and consequences. If he was wrong about what he was seeing, if he abandoned his post based on a misinterpretation of a child's gestures, he would face court-martial and likely imprisonment. His career would be over, his family's honor stained, and his grandfather's legacy tarnished. But if he was right, if this little girl was truly in danger and he did nothing to help her, how could he live with himself? How could he face his reflection in the mirror each morning, knowing he had chosen protocol over a child's safety? How could he honor the memory of his grandfather, who had fought against tyranny and oppression, if he stood by and watched evil unfold before his very eyes? The family began to move away from the gate, the man gripping the little girl's hand tightly, while the woman followed behind, wiping tears from her eyes. The girl looked back over her shoulder one last time, her dark eyes pleading with James across the courtyard. In that moment, he saw his own sister at that age, remembered his protective instincts, and the promise he had made to always stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. The weight of decision pressed down on him heavier than his ceremonial bearskin hat, heavier than his rifle, heavier than all the traditions and protocols that had shaped his life. In just a few moments, this family would disappear into the crowd of London tourists, and whatever was happening to this little girl would continue beyond his ability to intervene. James closed his eyes for just a split second, a movement so slight that no observer would notice. But in that brief darkness, he made a choice that would change his life forever. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was no longer fixed on the distant point he had been trained to watch. Instead, he was looking directly at the little girl, and for the first time in 6 years of faithful service, Sergeant James Mitchell was about to abandon his post. The protocols that had governed his every move, the traditions that had been passed down through generations of guardsmen, the sacred oath he had sworn to maintain his position no matter what occurred around him, all of it was about to crumble in the face of one small girl's desperate plea for help. As the family reached the edge of the courtyard, moving toward the busy London street beyond, James felt his feet begin to shift almost imperceptibly. The movement was so small that the tourists nearby noticed nothing, but, to James, it felt like an earthquake. He was breaking formation. He was abandoning his duty. He was choosing human compassion over military protocol. The little girl was still looking back at him, her hand now clutched tightly in the man's grip, her small legs struggling to keep pace with the adult's longer strides. The woman was walking with her head down, defeated and broken, and James was faced with the most important decision of his life: maintain his oath to the crown, or break every rule he had ever been taught in order to save a child he had never met. The sounds of London traffic grew louder as the family approached the street. Soon, They would be swallowed up by the city, just 3 more faces in a crowd of millions. The opportunity to act was disappearing with each passing second, and James felt the weight of that realization settling into his chest like a stone. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, not reciting military protocols or speaking of duty to the crown, but telling stories of ordinary people who had chosen to do extraordinary things when faced with evil. Men and women who had risked everything to help strangers, who had put human life above personal safety, who had understood that some things were more important than following orders. The little girl stumbled slightly, and the man jerked her upright roughly, causing her to cry out softly. That sound, barely audible over the noise of the courtyard, cut through James's heart like a knife. In that moment, all his training, all his dedication to protocol, all his fear of consequences melted away. There was only one thing that mattered now: getting to that child before it was too late. Without another moment's hesitation, James took his first step away from his post, beginning a journey that would lead him far from everything he had ever known, and into a situation that would test every principle he held dear. The first step was the hardest. James felt as though he was walking through thick mud as he moved away from his designated position, each footfall echoing in his ears like thunder. Around him, the normal sounds of the palace courtyard continued, tourists chattering, cameras clicking, children laughing. But, to James, everything seemed muffled and distant, as if he were moving through a dream. His fellow guards maintained their positions, their faces showing no recognition of his movement. They had been trained, just as he had, to ignore distractions and maintain their posts regardless of what happened around them. But James knew that his absence would be noticed soon enough, and, when it was, there would be serious consequences to face. The family was now about 50 meters ahead, moving steadily toward the palace gates that would take them out onto the busy London street. The man was walking quickly, his grip on the little girl's hand so tight that James could see her struggling to keep up. The woman followed a few steps behind, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield, her eyes downcast and defeated. As James moved closer, he began to hear fragments of their conversation. The language was unfamiliar to him, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The man's voice was low and harsh, filled with barely controlled rage. The woman responded in short, frightened whispers, while the little girl said nothing at all. Her earlier attempts to signal for help had ceased entirely, and she now walked in complete silence, her small body rigid with fear. James quickened his pace, his military training automatically calculating the best approach. He couldn't simply grab the child and run. That would likely result in a violent confrontation that could endanger the girl even more. He needed to be smart about this, to find a way to separate the child from the adults, or at least create enough of a distraction to draw attention to the situation. The weight of his rifle felt different now that he was moving with purpose rather than standing at attention. His red tunic, usually a source of pride, now felt like a beacon marking him as he moved through the crowd. Tourists began to notice his movement, pointing and taking pictures of the guard who was breaking protocol. Some looked confused, others excited to witness something unusual happening at the normally predictable palace. As James drew closer to the family, he began to pick up more details that confirmed his worst fears. The little girl's white dress, which had appeared clean and neat from a distance, was actually wrinkled and stained, as if she had been wearing it for days. Her hair, though neatly braided, was greasy and unkempt upon closer inspection. Most tellingly, she wore no coat despite the cool autumn weather, while both adults were dressed warmly in expensive outerwear. The man suddenly stopped walking and turned to the woman, his voice rising in what was clearly an argument about directions. James used this opportunity to move closer, positioning himself behind a group of tourists who were taking photos near the palace gates. From this vantage point, he could hear more of their conversation and observe the family dynamics more clearly. What he saw made his blood run cold. When the woman tried to respond to the man's angry questions, he cut her off with a sharp gesture that made her flinch visibly. The little girl had moved slightly away from both adults, but when the man noticed her movement, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her roughly back to his side. The girl's face contorted in pain, but she made no sound, as if she had learned through hard experience that crying out would only make things worse. James noticed something else that confirmed his suspicions. The girl was wearing shoes that were at least 2 sizes too large for her small feet. They looked expensive, probably belonging to the woman, but they caused the child to stumble with every step. No loving parent would force their child to walk in ill-fitting shoes, especially during what appeared to be a long day of sightseeing in London. The man resumed walking, now dragging the girl alongside him at a pace she could barely maintain. The woman hurried to catch up, and James could see tears streaming down her face as she struggled to keep pace with her companion's angry strides. Whatever relationship existed between these three people, it was clear that fear was the primary emotion binding them together. James realized he was running out of time. The family was approaching the main gates, and once they reached the street, they would disappear into the vast city of London. He had to act now, but he also had to be careful. If he simply confronted the man directly, there was no telling how he might react. The safety of both the woman and the child had to be his primary concern. Drawing on his military training, James began to formulate a plan. He needed to create a situation that would separate the family members, or at least draw enough public attention to the scene that the man would be forced to behave differently. The presence of witnesses and the possibility of police intervention might be enough to change the dynamic and give James the opportunity he needed to help the child. As the family reached the ornate iron gates of the palace, James made his move. He approached from an angle that would put him between the family and the street, effectively blocking their exit while appearing to simply be a guard performing his duties. When he was about 10 feet away, he called out in his most authoritative voice, "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with you for a moment." The man turned around, his face showing surprise and irritation at being addressed by a guard. The woman looked up with hope flickering in her eyes, while the little girl's face remained carefully blank, though James noticed her small hands clenching into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" The man replied in heavily accented English, his tone aggressive and impatient. "We are tourists. We have done nothing wrong." James had to think quickly. He had no official authority to detain anyone, and he had already abandoned his post in violation of direct orders. But he had committed himself to this course of action, and he wasn't going to back down now. "Sir, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I need to verify the identity of everyone in your group," James said, hoping his official tone would buy him some time. "It's just a routine security check." The man's eyes narrowed, and James could see him calculating his options. Around them, other tourists had begun to notice the confrontation, some stopping to watch while others hurried past, eager to avoid any unpleasantness during their vacation. "We have passports," the man said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket. "We are here legally." As the man fumbled for his documents, James noticed the little girl looking at him with renewed hope in her eyes. She caught his gaze and, very subtly, nodded her head once, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude that only he could see. In that moment, James knew with absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences he would face later. The woman, meanwhile, had taken a small step backward, creating some distance between herself and the man. James noticed that she was watching him intently, as if trying to understand whether he was truly there to help or simply performing routine security duties. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, and James saw what looked like finger-shaped bruises partially concealed by her scarf. "Sir, I'm going to need to see identification for all members of your party," James continued, his training helping him maintain a calm, authoritative demeanor despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, including the child. This request clearly agitated the man further. He said something sharp in his own language to the woman, who immediately looked down at the ground. The little girl, however, continued to watch James with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "The child has no papers," the man said dismissively. "She is, how do you say, my niece? She travels with us." James felt his suspicions crystallize into certainty. No responsible adult would travel internationally with a child who had no identification documents. Moreover, the man's hesitation and the way he avoided making eye contact while explaining the girl's presence suggested he was lying. "I see," James replied, pulling out a small notebook from his pocket to maintain the pretense of conducting an official investigation. "And what is the child's name?" The man glanced quickly at the woman before answering. "Her name is Maria Petrova." James noticed that the little girl's expression didn't change when this name was mentioned, another red flag in an already suspicious situation. Most children would react somehow to hearing their own name spoken, especially in such tense circumstances. "And your relationship to Maria?" James pressed, writing meaningless notes in his pad while keeping his eyes on the group. "I told you she is my niece, my sister's child," the man replied, his accent becoming thicker as his agitation increased. "Why are you asking so many questions? We have done nothing wrong." The woman had been silent throughout this exchange, but James noticed she was trembling slightly and kept glancing toward the busy street as if considering whether to run. The little girl remained perfectly still, but James could see her breathing had become shallow and rapid. James realized he needed to change tactics. His improvised security check had bought him some time and confirmed his suspicions, but it wasn't going to be enough to actually help the child. He needed to find a way to separate her from the adults or at least create enough of a disturbance to bring real authorities into the situation. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over here with me for a moment," James said, gesturing toward a spot near the palace wall that was within sight, but out of earshot of the woman and child. "There are some additional questions I need to ask you privately." The man's eyes flashed with anger, but he seemed to recognize that arguing with a guard at Buckingham Palace might draw unwanted attention from other authorities. After a moment's hesitation, he followed James to the designated spot, leaving the woman and child standing together near the gate. This was the opportunity James had been hoping for. With the man temporarily separated from his victims, James hoped the woman might feel safe enough to speak honestly about their situation. He also wanted to give the little girl a chance to communicate more freely without fear of immediate retaliation. As James began asking the man meaningless questions about his travel plans and the purpose of his visit to London, he kept one eye on the woman and child. What he saw filled him with both hope and dread. The moment the man was out of earshot, the little girl grabbed the woman's hand and began speaking to her in urgent, hushed tones. The woman looked down at the child with surprise, then glanced nervously toward where James stood with the man. James could see a silent conversation taking place between the woman and the girl, conducted through glances, gestures, and whispered words. The woman appeared to be asking questions, while the girl nodded or shook her head in response. At one point, the woman's eyes widened in apparent shock, and she looked directly at James with an expression that mixed hope with terror. The man, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly irritated with James's questions. His answers were growing shorter and more aggressive, and James could see he was beginning to suspect that this wasn't a routine security check. The pretense wasn't going to last much longer, and James knew he needed to make a decision about how to proceed. It was then that he noticed something that made his heart nearly stop beating. The little girl had pulled up the sleeve of her white dress slightly, and James could see dark bruises circling her tiny wrist like a bracelet. The marks were clearly from someone gripping her arm far too tightly, and they were recent enough to still show the distinct pattern of finger impressions. James felt a surge of anger so intense that he had to consciously control his breathing to maintain his professional demeanor. Whatever was happening to this child, it was serious enough to leave physical evidence. He was no longer dealing with a potentially uncomfortable family situation. He was witnessing clear evidence of child abuse, and possibly something even worse. The woman had noticed James looking at the girl's bruises, and she quickly helped the child pull her sleeve back down. But not before James saw her own reaction, a look of such profound sadness and guilt that it nearly broke his heart. This woman knew what was happening to the child, and she was either powerless to stop it or too frightened to try. James made a decision that would change all their lives. He was done with subtlety and pretense. These people needed real help, not careful questioning and diplomatic maneuvering. It was time to take direct action, regardless of the consequences to his career or his reputation. "Sir," he said to the man, his tone shifting from professional courtesy to barely controlled authority, "I'm going to need you to remain here while I contact my supervisor. There are some inconsistencies in your story that require further investigation." The man's face darkened with rage. "You cannot hold us here. We are tourists. We have rights. You have the right to remain here while this matter is resolved," James replied firmly. "And the child will be staying with me until we can verify her identity and her relationship to you." It was a complete bluff. James had no authority to detain anyone or separate families. But he was counting on the man's uncertainty about British law and his desire to avoid further scrutiny to buy him enough time to figure out his next move. The confrontation was about to escalate into something far more dangerous than James had anticipated, but he had passed the point of no return. One way or another, he was going to make sure that little girl was safe, even if it meant destroying his own life in the process. The man's reaction was immediate and violent. His face contorted with rage as he stepped closer to James, close enough that James could smell alcohol on his breath despite it being barely past noon. The careful mask of respectability that he had worn for the tourists fell away completely, revealing something dark and dangerous underneath. "You have no right," he hissed, switching between English and his native language in his fury. "You are just a guard. You cannot take the child. She belongs to me." The words "belongs to me" sent a chill down James's spine. No loving relative would speak about a child in terms of ownership, and the possessive fury in the man's voice confirmed James's worst fears about what this little girl was enduring. Around them, the situation was beginning to draw more attention. Other tourists had stopped to watch the confrontation, some taking photos and videos of what they assumed was an interesting security incident at the palace. A few moved closer, trying to hear what was being said, while others backed away, sensing the underlying violence in the man's demeanor. James noticed that his fellow guards had also become aware of the situation. From the corner of his eye, he could see Guard Thompson at the eastern gate turning slightly to observe what was happening, though protocol prevented him from abandoning his own post. James knew that radio calls were probably being made, and soon there would be real security personnel arriving to deal with what appeared to be a guard who had lost control of a routine situation. The woman and little girl had moved closer during the argument, and James could see the terror in both their faces. The woman was clutching the child's hand tightly, as if she could protect her through sheer willpower, while the girl watched the man with the wary alertness of someone who had learned to read the signs of impending violence. "Listen to me very carefully," James said to the man, his voice low but carrying the authority of his military training. "I don't know what you think you're doing with this child, but it ends here. You can walk away right now, but the girl stays with me." The man's eyes blazed with fury at this challenge to his control. "You know nothing," he spat. "Nothing. The girl is mine. Her mother owes me money, much money. The child works for me until the debt is paid. This is legal arrangement." The admission hit James like a physical blow. The man had just confessed to using a child as collateral for a debt, essentially admitting to human trafficking. James felt his hand tighten on his rifle, though he knew he could never actually use it in this situation. But the weight of the weapon reminded him that he was still a soldier, sworn to protect the innocent, even if that meant standing against the very protocols he had spent years learning to follow. "Sir, what you're describing is not legal in the United Kingdom," James replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Human trafficking is a serious crime, and I cannot allow you to leave with this child." The woman suddenly stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Please," she said in heavily accented English, addressing James directly for the first time. "Please help us. He took my daughter when I could not pay. I have been trying to get her back, but She couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. The little girl looked up at the woman with surprise and relief, as if she hadn't expected her mother to finally speak the truth. In that moment, James understood the dynamic he had been observing. This wasn't a family unit at all. It was a captor traveling with his victims, maintaining control through fear and isolation. The man rounded on the woman with fury, speaking rapidly in their shared language. James didn't need a translation to understand that he was threatening her, warning her to stay silent. The woman shrank back, but she didn't retract her statement, instead moving protectively in front of the little girl. James realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control it through words alone. The man was becoming increasingly agitated, and James could see him calculating whether he could overpower a single guard and escape with his human property. The arrival of actual security forces was now a certainty, but James wasn't sure they would arrive in time to prevent the man from becoming violent. It was then that something unexpected happened. The little girl, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, suddenly spoke up in clear, precise English. "My name is not Maria," she said, her voice small but brave. "My name is Anna Petrescu. I am 7 years old, and this man stole me from my mother 6 months ago. He makes me work in his restaurant, and he hurts me when I try to run away." The clarity and courage of her statement stunned everyone present. Here was a child who had endured months of abuse and trafficking, yet she found the strength to speak her truth when given the opportunity. James felt tears stinging his eyes as he looked down at this remarkable little girl who had risked everything to finally ask for help. The man lunged toward Anna, clearly intending to silence her before she could say anything else, but James stepped between them, using his body as a shield. The confrontation had moved beyond words now. This was a direct physical threat to a child, and James's every instinct as both a soldier and a human being demanded that he protect her. "Stay back," James commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his military authority. "You will not touch this child again." Around them, the crowd of tourists had grown larger and more agitated. Many were now filming the confrontation with their phones, and James could hear people calling for police assistance. The situation was becoming a public incident, which was both good and bad. Good because it would bring official help, bad because it was putting Anna and her mother in even more danger. The woman, Anna's mother, suddenly broke from her paralyzed fear and ran to her daughter, wrapping her arms around the little girl and holding her tight. The reunion was heartbreaking to witness, as both mother and child cried tears of relief and terror, knowing that while they had found each other again, they were still not safe. James could hear sirens in the distance now, growing closer by the moment. The Metropolitan Police would be arriving soon, along with palace security personnel who would want explanations for why a Queen's Guard had abandoned his post and become involved in what appeared to be a civilian dispute. James knew that his career was essentially over. There would be investigations, disciplinary hearings, and almost certainly criminal charges for dereliction of duty. But as he looked down at Anna, now safely in her mother's arms for the first time in 6 months, he felt no regret for his decision. Some things were more important than career advancement or military protocol. Some situations demanded that a person choose between following orders and following their conscience, and James had made his choice. The man was now backing away, realizing that the situation had deteriorated beyond his ability to control it. He was calculating whether he could disappear into the crowd before the police arrived, abandoning his victims, but preserving his freedom. James watched him carefully, knowing that men like this rarely gave up their control willingly, and that he might make one last desperate attempt to reclaim what he considered his property. "You have no idea what you have done," the man snarled at James. "There are others. This will not end here. You think you have saved them, but you have only made things worse." The threat was clear, and James felt a new weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. By intervening, he had potentially disrupted a larger criminal operation, which meant that Anna and her mother might still be in danger even after this immediate crisis was resolved. The man's words suggested that there were other children being exploited, other families being torn apart by the same criminal network. James made a mental note to relay this information to the police when they arrived. This incident was clearly part of something much larger than a single case of child trafficking, and the authorities would need to investigate the broader network that had enabled Anna's kidnapping and exploitation. The first police car arrived just as the man made his move to disappear into the crowd. James pointed him out to the officers, shouting a description and direction of travel. The man was quickly surrounded and apprehended, though not before he managed to hurl a string of threats and curses at James, Anna, and her mother. As the police took the man into custody, James found himself face to face with his commanding officer, Major Williams, whose expression was a mixture of anger, confusion, and grudging respect. Behind him stood several other palace guards and security personnel, all of whom were trying to understand how a routine duty assignment had turned into an international incident involving human trafficking and child rescue. "Sergeant Mitchell," Major Williams said, his voice carefully controlled, "you will need to explain to me exactly what happened here, and why you felt it necessary to abandon your post and involve yourself in civilian matters." James straightened to attention, though he kept one eye on Anna and her mother, who were now surrounded by police officers and social workers who had arrived on the scene. The little girl looked back at him once, mouthing the word "thank you" in a gesture so small that only he could see it. "Sir," James replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to confess. "I observed what I believed to be a child in immediate danger, and I made a decision to intervene. I understand that this action violated my orders and military protocol, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences." Major Williams studied James's face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him pause before responding. Around them, the courtyard was filling with police, social workers, media personnel who had caught wind of the story, and curious tourists who were documenting everything on their phones. The story of the Royal Guard who had broken centuries of protocol to save a trafficked child was already beginning to spread across social media, transforming James from an anonymous soldier into an unwitting symbol of human compassion triumphing over rigid authority. But for James, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that a 7-year-old girl named Anna Petrescu was finally safe, finally back in her mother's arms, finally free from the nightmare that had consumed 6 months of her young life. Whether he faced court-martial, imprisonment, or disgrace, he had done the right thing, and no amount of official punishment could take that away from him. As the police began interviewing Anna and her mother, as investigators started piecing together the details of the trafficking operation that had brought them to London, as his fellow guards watched him with a mixture of admiration and concern, James stood at attention and waited to learn what price he would pay for choosing humanity over protocol. The answer to that question would determine not only his own future, but would send ripples throughout the entire military establishment, forcing an examination of when blind obedience becomes complicity in evil, and when breaking the rules becomes the highest form of service to one's country and fellow human beings. Anna looked back at him one more time as she was led away to safety, her dark eyes now bright with hope instead of fear, and James knew that whatever happened next, he had already received the only reward that truly mattered. The interrogation room at New Scotland Yard was stark and windowless, furnished with only a metal table, 3 chairs, and a recording device that hummed quietly in the corner. James had been sitting there for nearly 4 hours, still wearing his red ceremonial tunic, though his bearskin hat and rifle had been confiscated when he arrived. The weight of the uniform, which had once filled him with pride, now felt like a costume from a play he no longer wanted to perform in. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun sat across from him, her notebook filled with details from his statement, her expression unreadable. She had been patient and professional throughout their conversation, asking detailed questions about his observations, his decision-making process, and the events that led to his intervention. But James could sense that there was more she wanted to understand about the man who had thrown away a distinguished military career to help a child he had never met. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Sergeant Mitchell," Detective Chin said, reviewing her notes. "You observed what you interpreted as distress signals from a 7-year-old girl, and based solely on those observations, you made the decision to abandon your post and confront 3 civilians?" "That's correct, ma'am," James replied, maintaining the formal tone he had been trained to use when addressing superior officers, even though Detective Chun was civilian law enforcement rather than military personnel. "And you understand that your actions violated direct orders and could result in serious disciplinary action, including court-martial and possible imprisonment?" James nodded. "I do understand that, ma'am. But I also understand that Anna Petrescu had been trafficked and was being held against her will. If I had followed protocol and remained at my post, she would have disappeared into London, and we might never have found her again." Detective Chun leaned back in her chair, studying James with the keen eye of someone who had spent years evaluating the credibility and motivations of witnesses and suspects. "Tell me about your military background, Sergeant. What made you want to join the Queen's Guard?" The question seemed to come from left field, but James answered honestly. "My grandfather served during World War II, ma'am. He used to tell me stories about the importance of standing up for people who couldn't defend themselves, about how sometimes doing the right thing meant going against orders. I suppose those lessons stuck with me. And yet you spent 6 years following military protocol without question, until today. What made this situation different?" James was quiet for a moment, remembering the look in Anna's eyes when she first tried to signal for help. "I've seen a lot of distressed tourists over the years, ma'am. Children having tantrums, families arguing, people who were lost or confused. But what I saw in that little girl's face, it wasn't ordinary distress. It was terror, pure, helpless terror. And when she started trying to communicate with me using hand signals, I realized she was being incredibly brave and resourceful in trying to get help. How could I ignore that?" Detective Chun made a note in her pad. "You mentioned that you have some training in sign language. Can you describe exactly what you observed?" James closed his eyes, recalling the desperate moments when Anna had tried to reach out to him. She would point to herself, then make a circular motion with her finger, then form what looked like the letter H with her hands. She repeated this pattern several times, always checking to make sure the adults weren't watching. Then, she made a slashing motion across her throat, and finally, pressed her hand to her heart, and pointed at me while mouthing what looked like, "Please." "And you interpreted this as a call for help?" "Yes, ma'am. The H could have stood for help. The circular motion might have represented being trapped, and the throat gesture was pretty clear in its meaning. But it was the desperation in her eyes that really convinced me. That child was terrified and trying everything she could think of to get someone's attention. Detective Chin nodded, making more notes. I've spoken with Anna and her mother extensively over the past few hours, Sergeant Mitchell. Would you like to know what they told me? James felt his heart rate increase. Yes, ma'am. Anna Petrescu is indeed 7 years old, and she was kidnapped from her home in Romania 6 months ago when her mother, Elena, couldn't pay debts owed to a criminal organization. The man you encountered, Victor Moldovan, is a mid-level operative in a human trafficking ring that operates throughout Eastern Europe and Western Europe. James felt a mixture of relief and horror washing over him. Relief that his instincts had been correct, horror at the confirmation of what Anna had endured. Detective Chun continued. Anna was forced to work in various businesses controlled by the organization, restaurants, cleaning services, even begging on street corners. She was beaten if she tried to escape or if she didn't bring in enough money each day. Her mother, Elena, was brought along to ensure Anna's compliance, but she was also being exploited and had been told that any attempt to escape or seek help would result in Anna being sold to worse situations. The clinical way Detective Chun described these horrors made them somehow even more terrible. James tried to imagine what Anna had endured over those 6 months, how a little girl had found the strength to survive such treatment and still have the courage to ask for help when the opportunity presented itself. The reason they were at Buckingham Palace today, Detective Chin went on, was that Moldovan was planning to move them to another location, possibly out of the country entirely. Anna somehow understood that this might be her last chance to get help, which is why she took the risk of trying to signal to you. James felt tears stinging his eyes. If he had followed protocol, if he had remained at his post, and ignored Anna's desperate signals, she would have disappeared forever into a nightmare that most people couldn't even imagine. There's something else you should know, Sergeant, Detective Chin said, her tone becoming more serious. Your intervention today has given us our first real break in a case we've been working on for over a year. Moldovan is already providing information about the trafficking network in exchange for a reduced sentence. We expect to make multiple arrests throughout Europe in the coming weeks, and we may be able to rescue other children who are being held in similar situations. The weight of this revelation settled over James like a heavy blanket. His decision to break protocol hadn't just saved Anna, it had potentially saved dozens of other children and helped bring down a criminal organization that had been operating with impunity. However, Detective Chin continued, there are still significant legal issues to address. You did abandon your military post without authorization, and you did involve yourself in civilian law enforcement matters without proper authority. The military is taking this very seriously. Before James could respond, there was a knock on the interrogation room door. Detective Chin answered it, speaking in low tones with someone in the hallway before turning back to James. Sergeant Mitchell, there are some people here who would like to speak with you. The door opened, and James was surprised to see Major Williams enter the room, followed by a man in an expensive suit whom James didn't recognize, and, finally, Anna and her mother Elena. Anna had been cleaned up and was wearing new clothes provided by social services, but she still looked small and fragile despite her brave demeanor. When she saw James, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire sterile room. Elena stepped forward first, her eyes red from crying but her voice strong. Sergeant Mitchell, she said in careful English, I want to thank you. You saved my daughter's life today, and you saved mine too. I will never forget what you did for us. The man in the suit stepped forward next. Sergeant Mitchell, I'm David Pemberton from the Crown Prosecution Service. I've been reviewing your case with Detective Chun and Major Williams, and I wanted to speak with you personally about the situation you've placed us all in. James straightened, expecting to hear about the charges he would face, and the legal proceedings that would destroy his career and possibly his freedom. But Pemberton's expression was not what he had anticipated. What you did today violated every protocol and regulation governing the behavior of the Queen's Guard, Pemberton continued. It was completely unauthorized, potentially dangerous, and absolutely contrary to your training and orders. James braced himself for what was coming next. It was also, Pemberton said with a slight smile, exactly the right thing to do. And it has helped us break up one of the most dangerous criminal organizations operating in Western Europe. James felt confusion replace his expectation of punishment. Sir, Major Williams stepped forward. James, you're not going to face court-martial. After consulting with senior command and reviewing the evidence that your actions directly led to saving a child's life and disrupting a major criminal enterprise, It has been decided that while your methods were unorthodox, your judgment was sound. Anna suddenly broke away from her mother and ran to James, throwing her small arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered in accented English. "Thank you for helping me when I was invisible." James felt tears flowing freely now as he looked down at this remarkable little girl who had endured so much but still had room in her heart for gratitude. He gently patted her back, remembering his sister at that age, and thinking about how different Anna's story could have ended if he had simply followed orders and looked the other way. "You were never invisible, Anna," he told her softly. "You were the bravest person I've ever met." Detective Chun cleared her throat. "There will still be paperwork, investigations, and testimony required. This case will likely take months to fully resolve, and both Anna and Elena will need ongoing support and protection as they rebuild their lives. But the immediate crisis is over, and these people are safe." Pemberton nodded. "Sergeant Mitchell, while you won't face criminal charges, there will be some administrative consequences. Your commanding officers need to maintain discipline and respect for protocol, even when those protocols are violated for the right reasons." James understood. "What kind of consequences, sir?" Major Williams answered. "You'll be transferred out of the Queen's Guard and reassigned to a different unit. Your security clearance will be reviewed, and there will be a formal reprimand in your military record. However," he paused, "there are also some opportunities that have arisen as a result of your actions today." "Opportunities, sir?" "The Ministry of Defense is establishing a new unit focused on human trafficking investigations that require military expertise. They're looking for soldiers who have demonstrated good judgment in complex situations and who understand that sometimes the mission is more important than the protocol. If you're interested, there's a position waiting for you." James felt his world shifting in ways he never could have imagined when he woke up that morning to begin what he thought would be another routine day of ceremonial duty. The career he had spent 6 years building was over, but something new and potentially more meaningful was being offered in its place. Anna looked up at him with those same dark eyes that had first captured his attention, but now they were bright with hope instead of clouded with fear. "Will you catch the other bad men too?" she asked. "Will you help the other children like me?" James looked around the room at the faces watching him. The detective who had treated him with respect despite his unorthodox actions, the prosecutor who had chosen justice over bureaucracy, the commanding officer who had found a way to discipline him while recognizing his courage, the mother who had regained her most precious possession, and the little girl who had shown him that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to serve the greater good. "Yes, Anna," he said firmly. "I will help the other children. That's what soldiers are supposed to do, protect people who can't protect themselves." As they prepared to leave the interrogation room, James reflected on how completely his life had changed in the span of a single day. He had begun the morning as Sergeant James Mitchell of the Queen's Guard, a man who followed orders without question and served with silent dedication. He was ending the day as someone entirely different, someone who had learned that true service sometimes required the courage to stand against authority when that authority failed to serve justice. The road ahead would be challenging. There would be investigations to conduct, criminals to apprehend, and other children to rescue. But as he walked out of New Scotland Yard with Anna's small hand tucked trustingly in his, James knew that he had finally found his true calling point. 3 months later, James stood in a nondescript office building in South London, far removed from the pageantry and tradition of Buckingham Palace. The walls were lined with maps, photographs, and case files related to human trafficking operations across Europe. His new uniform bore no ceremonial decorations, just practical clothing suitable for investigative work and the occasional undercover operation. But the sense of purpose he felt in this role was stronger than anything he had experienced during his years of ceremonial duty. Detective Inspector Saracen knocked on his office door, holding a thick file folder. "James, we've got something you need to see." The informal use of his first name still felt strange after years of military formality, but it reflected the different nature of his new role. As a liaison between the Metropolitan Police and the newly formed Ministry of Defense Human Trafficking Investigation Unit, James found himself working in an environment where results mattered more than rank and where unconventional thinking was valued rather than discouraged. "What have you found?" James asked, gesturing for Detective Chun to take a seat. "Remember what Moldovan told us about the larger network during his interrogation?" Chun opened the file and spread several photographs across James's desk. "Intelligence services across Europe have been tracking the connections, and We've identified at least 12 different operations in 6 countries. The scope is much larger than we initially thought. James studied the photographs, which showed various buildings, vehicles, and surveillance images of suspected criminals. The organization that had held Anna captive was apparently just one tentacle of a massive criminal enterprise that stretched from Romania to the United Kingdom, with branches reaching into France, Germany, and the Netherlands. How many children are we talking about? James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Conservative estimate? At least 40 children currently being held in various situations. Could be twice that number when we factor in the operations we haven't identified yet. The number hit James like a physical blow. 40 children, each with their own story of terror and exploitation, each as deserving of rescue as Anna had been. The magnitude of the problem was overwhelming, but it also reinforced his conviction that he had made the right choice in joining this unit. There's more, Chin continued, pointing to a particular photograph. One of the locations we've identified is a restaurant in Birmingham that appears to be using trafficked children as kitchen workers. The local police have been watching it for weeks, but they need someone to go in undercover to confirm the intelligence. James looked at the photograph of the restaurant, a seemingly normal establishment that could be hiding unthinkable horrors behind its ordinary facade. What kind of timeline are we looking at? The operation is set for next week. The question is whether you're ready for this kind of work. It's a long way from ceremonial guard duty. James thought about Anna, who was now living safely with her mother in a secure location while they both received counseling and support services. He had visited them several times over the past 3 months, watching Anna slowly regain her childhood confidence and seeing Elena rebuild her life free from fear. But he also knew that there were other children still trapped in the nightmare that Anna had escaped, children who might not have the courage or opportunity to signal for help as she had done. I'm ready, James said firmly. What do we need to do? Over the next week, James underwent intensive preparation for his first undercover operation. He learned about the restaurant industry, practiced speaking with a slight regional accent that would disguise his military background, and memorized the details of his cover identity. The work was meticulous and demanding, requiring skills he had never developed during his military training. But the most challenging aspect of the preparation was psychological. James had to learn to suppress his natural instincts to immediately intervene when he witnessed injustice or abuse. In order to successfully infiltrate the criminal organization and gather the evidence needed to rescue multiple children, he would have to watch terrible things happen without being able to stop them immediately. The knowledge that his restraint could ultimately save more lives didn't make the prospect any easier to bear. The restaurant, called European Delights, was located in a busy commercial district of Birmingham. From the outside, it appeared to be a legitimate family establishment, with cheerful decorations in the windows and a menu featuring traditional dishes from various Eastern European countries. But intelligence reports suggested that the kitchen staff included several children who were working without pay and living in deplorable conditions in a building behind the restaurant. James's cover story was that he was a former soldier looking for work and willing to take whatever position was available. His military background, rather than being a liability, was actually helpful in this context. Many of the criminal organizations specifically recruited people with military or security experience, valuing their discipline and skills while assuming their desperation for employment would override any moral concerns. On a rainy Monday morning, James walked into European Delights and asked to speak with the manager about possible employment. The restaurant was nearly empty, with only a few customers scattered among the tables. But as James waited to be seated, he could hear sounds from the kitchen that made his blood run cold. Adult voices shouting orders in harsh tones, and what sounded like a child crying. The manager, a heavy-set man with gold teeth and expensive jewelry, introduced himself as Dmitri and looked James over with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating both his usefulness and his potential threat level. After a brief conversation about James's background and his willingness to work for below minimum wages with no questions asked, Dmitri led him to the kitchen to see the operation firsthand. What James saw in that kitchen would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 children, none of whom could have been older than 10, were working frantically to prepare vegetables and clean dishes. They were painfully thin, their clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, and they moved with the terrified efficiency of people who had learned to anticipate punishment for any mistake. One of the children, a girl with blonde hair that hung in greasy tangles around her face, looked up when James and Dmitri entered the kitchen. For just a moment, her eyes met James's, and he saw the same expression of desperate hope that he had learned to recognize in Anna's face. This child was silently pleading for help, just as Anna had done, but James was forced to look away and pretend he noticed nothing unusual about the scene. Dmitri spoke to the children in what sounded like Ukrainian, his tone threatening and impatient. The children immediately worked faster, their small hands flying over their tasks with the kind of desperate speed that comes from knowing that any delay could result in violence. "They are good workers," Dmitri said to James in heavily accented English. "They do not complain, they do not ask for breaks, and they are grateful for the food we give them. Much better than British workers who want high wages and easy jobs." James forced himself to nod and smile, playing the role of someone who saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. Inside, he was calculating the layout of the building, noting the exits and entrances, and trying to figure out where the children were being housed. Every instinct he had developed as a soldier and as a human being was screaming at him to grab those children and get them to safety immediately. But he knew that such an action would only save 3 children while allowing the broader criminal network to escape and continue exploiting dozens of others. Dmitri offered James a trial position doing general maintenance and kitchen assistance, with the understanding that he would start the following day. As James prepared to leave the restaurant, the blonde girl managed to catch his eye one more time. With movements so subtle that only someone trained to look for them would notice, she made a small gesture with her hand, pointing to herself, then making a circular motion, then forming the letter H with her fingers. James felt his heart stop. This child had somehow learned the same signaling system that Anna had used, which suggested either that Anna had taught it to other children during her captivity, or that the trafficked children had developed their own methods of communication and mutual support. Either way, it meant that this girl knew exactly what she was doing when she tried to get his attention, and it meant that there were other children in the organization who might also be trying to find ways to ask for help. That night, James met with Detective Chun and the rest of the investigation team to report on his initial reconnaissance of the restaurant. The evidence he had gathered confirmed their suspicions about child trafficking, but it also revealed that the situation was even worse than they had anticipated. "We're looking at systematic exploitation of children who have been trafficked from multiple countries," James reported. "The children I saw appeared to be Ukrainian, but there may be others from Romania, Moldova, and possibly other Eastern European countries. They're being held in conditions that amount to slavery." Detective Chun reviewed James's notes and the photographs he had secretly taken with a concealed camera. "The question now is how we coordinate with international law enforcement to ensure we don't just shut down one location while the criminals move their operations elsewhere." The investigation team had been working with Europol and law enforcement agencies across Europe to plan a coordinated operation that would strike multiple locations simultaneously. The goal was not just to rescue the children being held in Birmingham, but to dismantle the entire network and arrest its leadership before they could relocate their operations or disappear entirely. "We think we have identification on most of the key players now," Detective Chin continued, showing James surveillance photos of various suspects. "The operation is scheduled for this Friday. You'll need to maintain your cover for 4 more days, gathering as much intelligence as possible about the daily routines and security measures." James nodded, though the prospect of returning to that kitchen and pretending not to see the children's suffering was almost unbearable. What about the children's safety during the raid? If the criminals feel trapped, they might try to use the kids as human shields or hurt them to prevent them from testifying. "We've planned for that contingency," Detective Chin assured him. "There will be specialized units focused specifically on child rescue, and we'll have medical and psychological support personnel standing by. The priority is getting those children to safety." Over the next 4 days, James continued working at European Delights, gathering intelligence while maintaining his cover as a desperate ex-soldier willing to ignore obvious criminal activity in exchange for employment. Each day was more difficult than the last, as he witnessed the systematic abuse and exploitation of children who had been stolen from their families and forced into lives of servitude. But he also began to understand the resilience and courage of these young victims. Despite their terrible circumstances, the children looked out for each other, sharing food when they could and offering comfort when one of them was punished. The blonde girl, who he learned was named Katia and was only 8 years old, had somehow appointed herself as a protector of the younger children, taking blame for their mistakes and trying to shield them from the worst of the violence. On Thursday evening, as James prepared to leave the restaurant after his final day of intelligence gathering, Katia approached him while Dmitri was distracted with other business. She pressed a small piece of paper into his hand so quickly that anyone watching would have missed the exchange. When James later examined the paper in private, he found a crude map drawn in pencil, showing the layout of the building where the children were housed. Katia had somehow figured out that he was there to help them, and she had risked her own safety to provide him with intelligence that could be crucial to their rescue. The map showed that there were actually more children being held than James had initially observed, 7 in total, ranging in age from 6 to 11. It also showed that they were kept locked in a basement room at night, with only one guard monitoring them. This information would be vital for the rescue teams to plan their approach and ensure that all the children could be reached quickly and safely. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, matching James's mood as he prepared for what would be the most important operation of his new career. As he put on his concealed recording equipment and checked his communication devices, he thought about Anna, safely recovering from her ordeal, and about the 7 children who were about to be rescued from theirs. At exactly 10 in the morning, the coordinated raids began simultaneously across 6 countries. James was inside European delights when the police arrived, and he watched as Dimitri's expression changed from confusion to terror as he realized what was happening. The rescue operation was swift and professional, with specialized teams immediately securing the children while other officers arrested the criminals. Katia looked at James with understanding in her eyes as she was led to safety by a social worker. She had known he was there to help, and her courage in trusting him had helped make the rescue possible. In that moment, James thought about the different ways that children could be brave. Anna with her desperate signals for help, Katia with her quiet intelligence gathering and protection of younger children, and all the other young victims who had somehow found the strength to survive their ordeals. The raids were a complete success, resulting in the arrest of 43 suspects and the rescue of 67 children across Europe. The criminal network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was dismantled in a matter of hours, brought down by the combined efforts of law enforcement agencies working together and the courage of children who refused to give up hope. As James watched the last of the rescued children being taken to safety, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning 3 months ago when Anna Petrescu had tried to signal for help outside Buckingham Palace. He had thought he was serving his country by standing motionless at attention, but he had learned that true service sometimes required the courage to abandon protocol and follow one's conscience. The red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard had made him feel important, but this new role, helping to rescue children from modern slavery, made him feel genuinely useful. And as he watched Katia being reunited with her family, who had flown to London as soon as they learned she had been found, James knew that he had finally found his true calling. Some protocols were meant to be broken, and some rules existed to be challenged when they stood in the way of protecting the innocent. The children who had been rescued would need time to heal from their trauma, but they were alive and free and surrounded by people who would help them rebuild their lives. And somewhere in London, Anna Petrescu was learning to be a child again, playing and laughing and dreaming about her future, all because a royal guard had decided that some things were more important than standing perfectly still.